Ha, ha.
Fields of swords, fields of wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and place, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. Today I'm going to talk about a subject that I get asked about a lot, and several minions have asked specifically for this, and I've put it off because it's a little complicated. But I think instead I'm going to embrace the complication in this case. And so the issue is, where does King Arthur come from? Where do Arthurian legends come from? And I have to say that I get the origin question about King Arthur every time I teach anything having to do with King Arthur. I get it in every class. And I don't think I get it almost ever for any other legendary figure or subject that I teach. Rarely are people interested in the subject, in the origins of it. So for example, when I teach Hamlet, I have to tell them, sorry, not Hamlet, but King Lear, I have to point out that this is based on historical events, though Shakespeare messes with them. And they've never even thought to ask the question, I wonder if this comes from a real story, right? But King Arthur, people always do. And if you get online and you start looking for the origins of King Arthur, you're going to see all sorts of answers. And some of them, even if you're not an expert, you'll look at and go like, well, that's obviously a crackpot answer. There are others that might be crackpot, but you're like, I don't know. I don't really know if I can say. And others that are clearly contradictory, but they seem scholarly, right? So what do we do with this? Well, first of all, we have to understand that there are a couple of reasons why, to begin with, it's almost an impossible question to answer. So the first thing I want to say is why it's an almost impossible question to answer. And then I'm going to get to why it's also the wrong question. So the first reason it's almost an impossible question to answer is because of something called archetypes. If you've studied literature for any length of time at all, you've heard of archetypes. Archetypes are these kind of characters or images or symbols or plot points which you find across different cultures, across times, even cultures that have no historical contact with one another, where we know that it wasn't transmitted by this is another version of the same story. And they can be incredibly similar. They're very mysterious, the origins of archetypes. Where archetypes come from is another issue. But King Arthur has a lot of archetypal elements to him. And so if I can find an Arthurian, a character who's very much like King Arthur, that predates King Arthur, that comes from another culture, it is possible that similarity is because that story was transmitted. Like it's another version of the same story, right? This is where the origin of it came from. But it's also possible that it is an archetype, that it simply came from a completely separate origin. And archetypes are easier to identify, that they don't have historical transmission, when we know for a fact that there wasn't any historical connection between these. One example I like to use is there's a story in the Maya epic, the Popol Vuh, about essentially a virgin who approaches a forbidden fruit, a forbidden tree that has a fruit on it that spits on her, and she becomes pregnant and then gives birth to these hero twins who are essentially the saviors of the world. They make the world safe for humanity. Okay. And it seems very much like a kind of syncretistic, let's combine Mayan mythology with Judeo-Christian mythology. We'll take Genesis and we'll take the gospel accounts, the conception of the virgin birth of Jesus, and we'll mix them all together. Except the problem is that because we also have this same event depicted on cups and other get depicted in artwork, Maya artwork, from centuries before the Europeans came to the New World. We know that they didn't get it from them, and in fact, even if we want to say, well, it's based on historical events, you could do that for Genesis, but you can't do that then for the virgin birth, because no matter how literally you take either account, the virgin birth happens after the last connection between the Maya and the Europeans, right? And so they couldn't have known about that. It's an archetype that bubbles up. And so in that case, we can say, well, that's an archetype for sure, right? Now, arguably, everything's an archetype, even if it's transmitted, but that doesn't come from transmission. Well, what about two cultures that are right next to one another? It's possible that one story is a transmission of the other story, but it's also possible that they simply bubbled up independently from one another, that they have the same archetypes, and this is why they are similar. So, it doesn't take very long for you to start to see that there suddenly is a moment, maybe in art, where the same ideas are popping up in all sorts of other places. Different places across the world, suddenly an idea just is in the air, and everyone is going for that idea. And so we have that with archetypes. And so first of all, it's almost an impossible question to answer unless the characters literally have the same names in some way. Because of archetypes, we're going to have, for certain, with a deeply archetypal character like Arthur, you're going to have unrelated characters and situations and symbols in other cultures which are not versions of the same thing, even if they predate it. They're just the same archetype, but not the same character, right? So archetypes, first of all, make that almost impossible to talk about. The second is, well, what do you mean by they come from, what's the origin of this? Because there is no single origin of Arthurian legend. The great Elizabeth Sklar, who taught me Arthurian literature, she used to compare King Arthur to a snowball that rolls down a hill, and as Arthurian myth rolls down a hill, it picks up more and more snow, and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, what's the origin? At what point of origin on that hill that the snowball's rolling down is the snowball? It's almost impossible to answer. Another good example of this is about a third of all Europeans can trace their lineage back to Charlemagne. So about a third of all Europeans can trace their lineage back to Charlemagne. However, all those same Europeans have many, 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 many other people that they're related to, completely disparate peoples that they are related to. And the same is true for Arthurian legend, right? So, for example, a good example would be a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Mark Twain takes the story of King Arthur and he turns it into a kind of time travel narrative. And he's invented the time travel narrative. Well, if you look at, I one time traced this out, and at least once per decade, Disney releases, just Disney, I'm not talking about every company, just Disney, at least once per decade, releases a version of On the Connecticut Yankee of King Arthur's Court, which is really more based on Mark Twain's story than on the original Arthurian legend. Or another thing, if you're like, well, that's really modern, I want to go back earlier. Well, we've got the Tristan and Isolde story. Tristan and Isolde story pre-exists to what we think of as Arthurian legend. Now, some people will argue that Arthurian legend goes back further, like to the Sarmatians or whomever, right? And it has this love triangle between King Mark and Tristan and Isolde, and that then gets brought in. Now that exists as its own literary tradition, but then it gets drawn into the Arthurian legend and becomes a love triangle between Guinevere, usually Lancelot, and Arthur. So is Tristan and Isolde the origin of Arthurian myth? Well, yeah. Is Mark Twain the origin of Arthurian myth? Yes. Like, all these things are. And there really is no, even if we could point to something and say, like, this dude was named King Arthur, and the very first story was about him, even that tells us almost nothing about the origins of them, in the same way that if you discovered that your ancestor was Charlemagne, yeah, but that tells you almost nothing about you, because you have many, many, many more ancestors who influenced you, a lot more. So really, I think those are the two reasons it's almost impossible to answer. The first one being because of archetypes, it's almost impossible to tell. And then second, even if you can directly pinpoint the origins, you're no more related to any one of your four grandparents than any of the other three, right? You're related to all of them. And that's with humans, who each just don't have two people that they come from. Stories will often have many, many, many more people. So, it's an almost impossible question to answer because of that. Okay, so let's say that it's almost impossible. But why is it the wrong question to answer, to ask? What is it about this question that makes it not helpful? Well, let's give a good example. Really, in terms of literature, we begin, I think, with Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. And which is way more about Constantine than about Arthur, by the way. And you get another really sort of early person who develops a lot of these things is Christian de Troyes' Arthurian Romances. Oops, I'll put that way so you can see it in case you're interested. So those are some early origins, but when you think about King Arthur, what do you think about? Well, for example, you think about knights in shining armor. Except the problem is that in the time of the Britons, who all the earliest, folks from Geoffrey of Monmouth, you have Watcha, Layman, all these early writers all place King Arthur in the time of the Britons. The problem is you don't really have knights in shining armor until many, 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 many centuries later. And so the idea of the heavily armored guy on Cav, which is central to Arthurian, to our understanding of Arthur, is a thing which cannot exist. So Arthur, at its very earliest beginnings as a literature, is already ahistorical. It already doesn't make sense. It is centuries removed. If we rewrote legends about, say, George Washington, in which he has a battalion of tanks or bombers, that would actually be closer in time historically. That would be more historical than what we have in terms of this kind of chivalric notions that we have with King Arthur. That would be closer in time, both culturally, technologically, in every way, than what we have with King Arthur. Just to give you a sense of how far away it is. So what I would argue is, even if we can point to this historical thing or that historical thing and connect it to Arthur, in fact, King Arthur is not a historical figure in any real way, because as we understand King Arthur, as we think about him, he's a character in this narrative, right? And the narrative is amorphous. And if you wanted to write a new Arthurian legend like Mark Twain did, or like Christian de Troyes did, or any number of other people in the Middle Ages did, if you wanted to write a new Arthurian legend where you combined it with some other story that you were interested in, some other story that you didn't write that comes from the past, that would be fine. And centuries from now, not even centuries, 20 years from now, if others have forgotten that whole inclusion of this other storyline into King Arthur has come from you doing this, that makes it no less King Arthur. that makes it still Arthuriana. And this is, I think, one of the beauties of King Arthur, is that Arthurian legend is constantly able to absorb more and more and more while still retaining its own essence, while still being itself. And so if we could somehow, if it weren't the wrong question, and we could answer it, and we could somehow find an origin for King Arthur, I think that would really cheapen it, make it less than it is, because King Arthur is so much more. It combines really the values and the hopes and dreams of many peoples from many different cultures across the centuries. And when we enjoy it today, we are really participating with our ancestors, with other people in other cultures, with other people from other languages, far-flung around the world, who also want to participate in this same deep mythological pageant that we call Arthurian legend.